Hello and welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you are joining us. Thank you. My name is Faith Thomas and I am a Senior Program Coordinator at the Institute for Disability Research and Practice at Utah State University, which is a University Center for Excellence on Developmental Disabilities. We also have the Mental Health and Developmental Disabilities National Training Center, which is a collaboration between the University of Kentucky, the University of Alaska in Anchorage, and Utah State University. And we are a national clearinghouse, and we work to improve mental health services and supports for people with developmental disabilities. The Mental Health and Developmental Disabilities National Training Center is proud to bring you the third webinar in our continuing education series on an introduction for mental health practitioners working with clients with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Before we start, I'd like to extend a message to all of you on behalf of the entire MHDD team that during this unique and challenging time we're in, please know that our team is mindful that our current climate is impacting both our physical and mental health. Please continue to visit our social media for resources related to mental health, disability, and COVID-19. And please let us know if there's anything that we can do to support you through this process. You can find us at mhddcenter.org or MHDD Center on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. So it's my pleasure to introduce our two presenters today, Dr. Shelley Upton and Dr. Ty Aller. Dr. Upton is a postdoctoral fellow at Utah State University. She received her PhD in school psychology from Louisiana State University in 2020 and completed her predoctoral internship at the University Center for Child and Family at the University of Michigan, where her primary focus was on providing services to children with autism spectrum disorder, ADHD, and specific learning disability. Dr. Upton's research focuses on the utilization of mindfulness-based interventions and acceptance and commitment therapy. Dr. Aller is a licensed marriage and family therapist who has also earned a PhD in human development and family studies from Utah State. He currently serves as a senior program coordinator at the Center for Persons with Disabilities. And he is also has training and practice in applying trauma-focused cognitive behavior therapy and acceptance and commitment therapy with individuals with disabilities, developmental disabilities. Dr. Aller also conducts research and explores psychological flexibility in individuals with autism. This webinar, just as the other two in this series, is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel and website, mhddcenter.org. Lastly, we will be sending out a follow-up email after this live webinar with a post-evaluation, and you will also see that Ty has already posted that in our chat as well. We do ask that you complete that evaluation for us so we can improve future webinars. In the follow-up email, you will also receive instructions on how to receive continuing education credit for participating. So without further ado, the time is yours, Drs. Upton and Aller.
Looks like I'll take us away here at the beginning. I forgot I had that at the beginning. Thank you, Faith, for introducing us, and welcome to everyone. We actually have a pretty big group of us. About 120 people are jumping in. So thanks for the introduction. My name is Ty, and I have not changed in our script the name of our institute right now. We just went through a name change from the Centers for Persons with Disabilities to is it the Institute of Disability Research, or Institute on Disability Research, Policy, and Practice, I believe. So sorry about that, Faith. If we can go to the next slide here, we'll go over just some basic housekeeping for everyone. So we're all probably pretty used to the Zoom etiquette by now, but we have closed captioning going on. And if you have any issues there, please just direct those to Faith or Mindy. Mindy Dacos. She'll be monitoring the chat for us as we go, and I'll try to be jumping in as well. We do have some discussion questions throughout the presentation today to try to make it a little bit more interactive than our first two. That's primarily because we think this is a lot of applied work, and we would like to interact with the questions that y'all have throughout to help us inform the presentation. So please work at responding to those questions within the chat so we can make it more useful for you all that are joining us. We just ask that you leave the video and audio off. It helps with our recording so we can actually frame the people that are speaking up at the top. And then just to let y'all know how we usually set these up is it's about 1 hour of content, and we try to get through quite a bit of content pretty quickly. So you're gonna hear a lot of talking from me and Shelly, but at the end, we save a half an hour, and we're willing to stay for that whole half an hour to talk with y'all, and we'll even open up the mics and videos to kind of have a more interactive session. We found that that's been pretty useful for participants. So we'll move past the Zoom etiquette now and jump right on in. Today's objectives, we're really trying to summarize the current state of literature on evidence-based treatment for individuals with IDD. As providers out in the communities and individuals that may not be as connected with the university, it can sometimes be hard to stay abreast of what's actually going on in the research. So we'll give you a quick summary and an overview of kind of what we're seeing in this topic and some future next steps. We're going to describe 3 evidence-based modifications, 2 treatments that we know can be helpful, and then also provide some other suggestions through the clinical work that both Shelly and I have done. And then hopefully by the end, you'll feel like you could probably employ 2 evidence-based interventions in a therapeutic setting. I will make a caveat that, like all interventions, we can always learn more. So we're kind of basing it off the assumption that we have some foundational knowledge of what CBT might look like or what acceptance and commitment therapy might look like. And we're going to be talking through basic modifications to those treatments that have been supported in the evidence as being useful. So to begin, we're going to start with just a brief reflection question to try to get a kind of a pulse on where we're all starting at. So some of the questions I have for y'all are, what intervention approaches have you used or adapted in your work with individuals with IDD to address mental health concerns? And then more specifically, what do you feel like has gone well? And then maybe what didn't go as well as you had hoped or what you had planned. So feel free to open up the chat, and we're going to give you all about a minute to kind of reflect on this question, and then we'll kind of take that information from the chat and use it to inform the rest of the presentation. Awesome. So we're seeing some CBT, DBT, and behavior-based strategies. Yeah, thanks, Carol. There's actually a DBT skills workbook for individuals with intellectual disabilities out there that's got some pretty good evidence behind it. What other intervention approaches have people use? Okay, TFCBT, CBT, and DBT, some mindfulness. We'll go over some of that. Oh, motivational interviewing. Yeah, that's can be a really useful approach. Solution-focused, EMDR. Awesome. Any thoughts on maybe what went well or maybe what didn't go as well as you'd hoped? This will kind of give us some information on, you know, what are some of the potential roadblocks that we have or we experience as clinicians working with these individuals. Okay, trauma-informed viewpoint for approaching behavioral concerns, tactile and visual interventions, nonverbal clients. Yeah, I think we get some of this pretty naturally throughout our content. We'll take about 15 more seconds. Yeah, barriers from caregivers too. Yeah, working with caregivers, trying to find ways that are most useful for clients and the families. Yeah, I think Shelly will approach that one too. A lot of the cognitive strategies based on cognitive levels. Yep, and advocating for alternative treatment. I'll hit that one here in these first 2 slides too. Awesome. Well, as we go, if you have more questions, feel free to just pop them into the chat. We're doing our best to monitor that. And here in a second, I will be switching over to Shelly presenting more, so I'll be able to monitor it more in depth. But we love to have you all engaged and keep them coming. So just as a brief introduction, the project that helps us kind of run these webinars is called the Mental Health and Developmental Disabilities National Training Center. And within that training center, one of the first jobs that I did was worked with our team to try to kind of compile what was going on in the evidence-based literature on like what seems to be working, where are our research holes, and kind of where the evidence is. And what we quickly found are that medications tend to be the first line of treatment for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And we're often using the medication as an approach to manage behavior. And this can be pretty concerning because it doesn't see an individual as the holistic person focusing on strengths-based strategies to, promote their mental health and well-being. It can be a useful side tool, but often we're seeing a lot of antipsychotic medication usage to manage bigger behaviors rather than trying to see, is that behavior communicating an emotional need that there's maybe a more useful strategy for the client. And a lot of these traditional psychological interventions really focus on reducing problem behaviors. That's often why people come into our room, is we're seeing these problem behaviors rather than, viewing this individual as how do we promote their mental well-being and help them live a more, values-driven life or a more prosperous life full with well-being. So what we'll try to do is shift that orientation of a lot of these models to how do we actually promote well-being rather than just treating these problem behaviors that people will often report. It's not to say that these problem behaviors aren't concerning. It's just we think there are more useful strategies to approach those rather than just medication, which again can often be useful, but trying to shift that orientation to a strengths-based approach. And there is some growing literature that we'll briefly cover that says that a lot of our intervention strategies are actually useful for promoting this mental health like we're talking about. So a very brief snapshot on the state of the evidence. There are actually, I don't know, I think there are probably like 3 groups in the nation right now that are really pushing hard to get a better grasp on the state of the evidence and then starting to propose projects to kind of build a more robust evidence base for these treatments. So what we see as a snapshot in the literature is that psychopharmacological interventions should not necessarily be a default first line of treatment. Well, that is a little bit of an opinion, and more of what we're seeing in the literature is that psychopharmacology is used. It seems to help behaviors, but there are a lot of negative side effects, and we may not actually be managing the system or having a system of care that can promote that mental health and well-being. So we're trying to start looking at what are the effectiveness of specific psychological interventions. Well, the evidence kind of says that it continues to be weak or inconclusive. A lot of this is due to methodological concerns. So for instance, getting enough individuals to complete treatments to have robust sample size to be able to detect an effect. So a lot of the research-based things. We're seeing preliminary and a lot of pilot feasibility or usability studies around CBT. And it says, yeah, it seems to be feasible, it seems to be usable, but as far as effectiveness and efficacy studies on do we actually see treatment effects or improvements in well-being, that's where the evidence still is lacking. And, interestingly, the literature about 15 or 20 years, when you read the discussion sections on those papers, it often explains the same thing. Is, hey, we don't know, we need more robust research, and we're kind of still at the same spot, unfortunately. Some of the up-and-coming therapies, though, that are starting to get more traction, and what I mean by up-and-coming is they're getting more evidence behind them within individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities, are things like psychoanalytic therapy, CBT, a lot of mindfulness therapies. DBT has actually quite a bit of evidence on some of their skills training. And then acceptance and commitment therapy. So we're seeing people start to work more within this population and adapting existing protocols. but the research methodology and getting enough of the research publications out, it's still lacking and growing. So a lot of what we'll be talking about today is informed by the evidence and also informed by clinical work. And that has potential downfalls that we can discuss at the end, but that gives you a brief snapshot. So now I'll turn, I think, the time right over to Shelley here, and she'll take us away.
Yes. So I'll talk briefly about cognitive behavior therapy and also mindfulness-based interventions. So there have been some modified protocols for CBT, some augmented protocols for CBT, so adding in extra things. And so that has shown effectiveness for anxiety and depression, particularly with people who have mild intellectual or developmental disabilities, because cognitive behavior therapy is a lot of talking and it's a lot of cognitive skills. And so if their verbal abilities are below average or lower than what we expect, they may not be able to get as much benefit from those cognitive focused strategies. And so most of the adapted CBT protocols are with people who have average or just below average IQs. And if their verbal abilities are quite low, then the cognitive parts of cognitive behavior therapy are not as helpful. For mindfulness-based interventions, so things like MBSR, mindfulness-based stress reduction, or mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, if you've ever given these interventions or participated in them, you know that it's lots of metaphors, lots of abstract language, and that can be really, that kind of has the same problem. If verbal abilities are low, it's very cognitive. And so we really want to simplify skills, reduce them down to their most essential parts, and remove a lot of the abstract language or the make it more concrete for somebody to be able to pay attention to and to synthesize and understand. And so I'm going to talk specifically about a mindfulness intervention that was not modified for people with IDD, but directly developed for them. And it's called Soles of the Feet. So I'll talk about that in a little bit. So for next steps, we really want to see more research that's community-based, informed by lived experiences, and has a strengths-based approach. We know, these kind of preliminary studies, they might not have very many people in them, or they might not have really strong methods, but if we can have more translational studies rather than usability or feasibility studies, we know that they're valid or whatever, but we want to make sure that they can actually be employed out in the community.
Shelley, if you're okay, just saying one thing too that I think is important to note is that within the clinical research, groups with severe mental illness or serious mental illness and groups from, into like intellectual and developmental disabilities, they've been historically really treated poorly within the clinical research. And so what I really hope that we can start orienting to is using more lived experience to inform a lot of these interventions and the research on it. And so a lot of the teams you'll talk to across the nation, especially within the USAID networks, are trying to find ways to not only adapt these interventions, but have them be informed by people with lived experience so that we're not committing the same crimes over and over again and harming people. So some of the reason why the evidence is a little bit slower moving isn't because people aren't doing the work. It's because it's taking a lot of time, so we make sure that we're not committing the same types of harm that we were doing earlier in the development of psychotherapy. That is all I wanted to say there, so thank you for letting me interject.
You're welcome. Not a problem. You're the co-presenter. So I'm going to review just briefly some of the accommodations or adaptations that we've talked about in previous webinars if you were not able to join us for those. So we want to make sure that we can allow time for processing and perhaps adjust our pacing. If we know that if somebody's processing speed is a little slower, we might want to slow down when we're talking. If we know that somebody, for instance, has ADHD and they might need something a little quicker because they might lose attention if you're talking too slowly. So make sure that you're adjusting your pace and allowing time for processing. Really avoid clinical jargon, cliches, metaphors, repeat back for clarification, check and make sure that there's understanding. A lot of the research on adaptations that I've read, visual supports are huge. Using visual aids to assist and label feelings or talk about symptoms or providing a timeline of symptoms. This is really, really important because if we know perhaps their verbal skills are below average or not where we might expect for somebody their age, visual aids can be really, really helpful. And then we also want to acknowledge and accept their own perspective. I think, we've discussed this in previous webinars, but we want to make sure that, while we're the experts and we're the ones delivering the therapy, they're the expert on themselves. And we want to make sure that they're involved in the choosing of their treatment and they're an active participant and that we are acknowledging their perspective and taking into consideration their own values.
Before we move on to that next slide, I think it's important to note kind of two things on these adaptations is that it can feel kind of overwhelming to have all of these planned out before. So allowing yourself to kind of evolve and grow a toolkit can be really useful. So for instance, I always have like a couple of small whiteboards in my office, and that has been super useful to get to the visual aids. Whereas I think Shelly mentioned last time, you've actually have like Pinterest channels that you like get resources from, is it special education teachers that you're getting resources from?
Yeah, most of them are special education teachers or speech language pathologists. Pinterest is like, it's got so much stuff. It's got everything. So it can be kind of daunting to wade through, but I've often found like, I don't enjoy recreating the wheel. So if I know I'm looking for like something really interesting about, learning how to use the microwave, like a social story or something, there's probably something on Pinterest with cute little pictures. So I think that's a really great resource to just look and see if something is there, particularly visual aids.
Yeah, and one other one that I've seen some of my colleagues use they actually have therapy dogs, and being able to show, different emotions within their animals can be really useful as a visual aid for kiddos. I've seen it with kiddos with autism. Using dogs can be helpful. I've also done equine therapy. So it's really trying to be able to figure out what skills and resources you have available and then building from there, not feeling like you have to recreate the wheel or be a specific specialized provider, because to serve the population, we got to start serving people to get that experience. The last thing I was just going to note on that, acknowledge and accept clients' perspectives, is that depending on the culture you're living within, working and collaborating with caregivers and clients can look very different. And so you want to be a little bit mindful of how does your state, work around with caregivers, especially for individuals that may be over 18. But, like legal guardianship issues, because that can look very different state by state. And if you have kind of a working understanding of what that might look like, it gives you a plan on how am I going to work with these providers, work with these caregivers up front, so that you're not stumbling a lot. And that's a lesson I learned myself, is that not being aware of that before can, do more harm than good at times. So that's a way to look through it. We can talk more about that in the Q&A.
Mm-hmm. And just some other adaptations. avoiding really lengthy explanations, trying to limit open-ended questions, asking one question at a time, having active listening skills, validating, normalizing feelings, and staying conscious of the time as well. If you know that they're going to be overstimulated by a 50-minute long session, can we shorten it? And adapt that as well so that they're not, having a lot of listening fatigue and just getting overwhelmed with the time.
One of my favorite sessions was actually going on a scavenger hunt around my office outside with a kiddo with autism. And we were able to do the same exact type of stuff we were working on, but we both got out, got some steps in, and got some fresh air. So allowing yourself to kind of like be experiential and break out of the normal sit in your office and talk can be super useful.
Yeah. So I'm going to go over just a brief clinical vignette, and then I will talk about the meditation on the soles of the feet and how it can be used specifically for aggression, but also just frustration in general. So this was a client. His name and some information has been changed, but Travis is a 9-year-old boy who is referred for aggressive behaviors that manifest when he is frustrated or not getting his way. He has been diagnosed with ASD, autism spectrum disorder, and has a below average IQ. He is not aggressive with the therapist, but primarily directs his aggression towards his mother and his sister. And his aggression is primarily scratching, and sometimes biting and spitting. So for meditation on the soles of the feet, this was developed by Dr. Nirbhay Singh, and it was originally, many of the articles that talk about soles of the feet were implemented in group home settings, and with the goal of, reducing aggression and also helping people keep their placements. Because as many of you know, if you have significant behavioral problems, you might get referred to a more intensive placement. So the goal there was to keep them in the least restrictive environment possible, and reduce their aggressive behaviors. So typically, I'll preface this a little bit. Typically, when we're teaching mindfulness skills to somebody, we might instruct them to focus on their breath. And even that can be kind of strange for people who have never focused on their breath before. And in order to make that a little more concrete, he adapted that to say, we're going to focus on the bottoms of our feet. We're going to practice shifting our attention to the bottoms of our feet. So these are the instructions for soles of the feet. So you have your client stand in a natural open posture with the soles of your feet flat on the floor. If you're sitting, you can sit comfortably with both feet flat on the floor. Breathe naturally, don't try to control your breathing. And what you do in the moment is give them a prompt to think of something that made them angry, made them frustrated, and kind of walk them through those feelings. So say, stay with that anger. You're feeling angry. Angry thoughts are flowing. Let them kind of happen, and your body may start to show signs of anger. And so keep an eye on that. What is that for your client? Is it rapid breathing? Is it increased heart rate? Is it feeling flushed? And as you're staying with that feeling of anger, shift your attention to the bottoms of your feet, to the soles of your feet. Slowly move your toes. Feel the feeling of your shoes. Are you wearing socks? Feel the texture of your socks, the curve of the arch of your foot, the heels of your feet against the back of your shoes, feeling the floor, the carpet beneath your feet. Keep breathing naturally. Try not to control your breathing, and focus on the bottoms of your feet and describing them to yourself until you feel calm. So this is mindfulness, a mindfulness-based strategy that is encouraging the person to focus on the physical feeling of their feet and practicing shifting their attention away from whatever it is that is making them frustrated or making them angry. And so we want to practice this in session when we're not angry, but we're recalling an incident that made us frustrated or made us angry. And then the more that we practice it, either with different imaginations or different memories, we can then begin to practice it in vivo, in person, when something is actually happening. So you remember, practice this mindfulness exercise whenever something occurs that might lead you to be being verbally or physically aggressive. And remember that once you are calm, you can walk away from the incident or situation because you were able to control your anger. And so with the little boy that I used this with, we would practice it in session, and his mom would tell me ahead of time, this week Travis got really upset because he, didn't get the ice cream that he wanted when we were at Walmart. He asked for an ice cream and I told him no. And so she kind of primed me and gave me incidents from the previous week that made him frustrated or made him angry that precipitated aggression. And so then we would recall those in session and I would have him think about them and practice doing this while he was thinking about it. And then eventually what I did was I instructed mom on how to do this with him so that in the moment, later on in the week when he's not with me, she can instruct him to do this. And I think that this is a good, more concrete exercise of mindfulness for people because it is focusing on the physical feeling of your feet. And rather than focusing on breathing, which can be, it can be kind of confusing. There are a lot of aspects of breathing. And so if focusing on the breath is difficult, this is a great intervention to try.
Shelley, before we move on there, I'd be interested to hear a little bit more from the group.
Mm-hmm.
This is a really concrete example of how to apply mindfulness within a session. And I'm kind of curious from those out there, Rhonda mentioned kind of some of her experience with timing and setting compassionate expectations. I'd be interested in hearing what are their reactions about this type of activity and what are maybe some of the concerns. We have oodles of time here to be able to talk through some of this, and that was purposeful.
Mm-hmm.
So let's maybe give everyone a minute or two to reflect on things and see if we can get some questions going that we might be able to help address.
Sure.
Yeah, like it can be done anywhere.
Mm-hmm. And it doesn't, I should have prefaced this well, it could also be done in instances that are not aggression or frustration or anger related. If you know that perhaps that might be too salient or too intense for your client, you can start it with other more positive or more neutral emotions. So Dawn asks, the creator of this approach, his name is Neuro Singh. I'm going to type it in the chat. And it is evidence-based. He's done several studies with this. And I'm forgetting the institution where he works. He used to be in North Carolina, but then he was in Atlanta. I'm not remembering, but his name is Neuro Singh. Yes, and Malia, we will be sending out the presentation slides as well.
A couple of the questions that came up was like, how much practice might someone need to be able to do these skills?
Mm-hmm.
And, ability to recall previous events, which, that is something that often comes up in my work with individuals, with developmental disabilities. What do you think about those, Shelley?
I think that's a great question, because we know, for instance, individuals with autism spectrum disorder or individuals with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder often have a hard time with generalization. So learning a skill in one context and then applying it to another context might be particularly tricky. And so when I did this with Travis, and I've also done mindfulness interventions with teenagers who have fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, we're practicing a lot. I'm practicing it several times with them in session. I'm asking them to practice later during the week. Having them practice multiple times with multiple examples, and I'll talk about multiple exemplars, I think, on the next slide. Yeah, so we know, like, especially, I'll speak about teenagers with fetal alcohol spectrum disorders, because that's probably the most experience I have with mindfulness and teaching it to them. And so they often have difficulty with generalization. So we do these multiple exemplars where, we're giving them multiple chances for practice. We're practicing every day. We are using different imaginations or different memories to recall while we're doing it. It's something that needs to be repeated several times. And so it might depend on your client, or it might depend on their level of cognitive functioning, how quickly they might be able to generalize it to other situations. And so multiple exemplars, this is something that is frequently talked about within, like, behavioral therapy. So practicing the same skill in multiple scenarios. So these are just some examples of different scenarios, different things that might happen. And these are specifically from, like, a group home setting. So responding to someone who is saying something that offends you, responding to a peer that threatens you, responding to staff members or coworkers, responding to someone who is aggressive to you first. And so the question about using it with adults, yes, it is very helpful with adults. And I believe several of the research articles were done with older adults who were living in group homes.
I think one thing I would add on there too is that, because the research isn't super clear yet, you're seeing a lot of groups developing this type of work. So for instance, in one of my previous jobs working at a nonprofit organization here in my community, we were, using a framework called ARC. I believe it stands for, like, Attachment Regulation Competency. And it was actually developed of kiddos that have experienced trauma, that also have ASD, that were living in a group home, and we were adapting that to try to, serve more of an outpatient community model. And a lot of it was focusing on routines, consistency, and giving multiple chances throughout each session to focus on one skill. As a provider that came from working with more college-age students to working with kiddos that experienced complex trauma and also had developmental disabilities, it can sometimes feel like, wow, am I giving these individuals enough? But watching the change and growth was so useful. So just one thing you may want to note as a clinician is that it may feel a little bit different or a little bit slower at times because you're really focusing on repetition and routine. But that can be so useful and powerful. So giving yourself some chance to slow things down and, helping caregivers or family members to slow or have compassionate expectations, like Rhonda said, can be really useful, like, tips to try to use these interventions.
Yeah. And another thing, I was thinking of a different client that I had who he really didn't enjoy the metaphors. So I was doing ACT with him, acceptance and commitment therapy, and I was explaining to him, kind of like, if you're familiar with ACT, self as context. So being able to see yourself kind of separate from your own experiences. And he was, like, looking at me. He goes, "Why don't you just say metacognition?" And I was like, "Great point, thank you." I loved how direct he was. He was like, "You don't need to explain it like that. Just say metacognition. I know what that means." And I was like, "Okay, great." But in ACT, where, when you do training in ACT, everything is explained in metaphors. And he was like, "You don't have to do that. Just tell me metacognition. Thanks." And so we'll talk about DBT and then also some ACT adaptations. So DBT, again, using really simplified or concrete language rather than these metaphors. Like I perhaps underestimated that client, don't underestimate your clients. They probably can understand what you're talking about. Increased use of visual aids, giving more frequent feedback. Again, a theme that we've seen throughout research and throughout these adaptations and modifications is multiple opportunities for practice, involving families and caregivers where relevant, and utilizing smaller groups. So part of DBT interventions is group therapy. And so they have talked about how it's important to just have smaller groups to allow for more active participation from the clients. Anything you want to add, Ty, about DBT before I move on to ACT?
I know that, so people are sharing in the chat kind of that soles of the feet instructions there, which is really useful. And with the
Yeah.
I know there's a workbook that if you just type in like Google Scholar, and I can't actually remember the individual who does it right now, but there's a workbook that has some good evidence behind it with DBT skills for emotion regulation that a lot of people in the field refer to. And it really gives you some useful adaptations to specific DBT skills manuals you'd see for this population. And it's one that, like, when I talk to other providers, they're like, well, do you have like an instructional manual? And usually we have to say no, but within the DBT world, there is actually one. Yeah, Julie Brown's, there it is. Julie Brown's Skill Systems for Cognitively Challenged Adults. I think it's pretty useful. There's probably need for more evidence as always from a researcher standpoint, but probably a good starting resource if you're looking for one.
And so for ACT interventions, there's been one study that I found where they adapted ACT for adults with autism spectrum disorder, and they called it Neuro Act. And they found some preliminary efficacy and feasibility. They, in particular, found that it improved psychological flexibility. So being able to kind of appropriately respond to things and also decrease stress as well. And so with ACT, like I shared with my one client, it's very metaphor heavy. It's pretty abstract. There's a lot of, experiential exercises. And so consider distilling those down or adapting them for the particular client that you have. Another thing that I want to make sure that I kind of touch on with any intervention that you're doing, we've talked about how a client's experience of depression or anxiety could be completely unrelated to their disability, right? Or it could be secondary to a symptom that is consistent with their disability. So for example, an adult with autism spectrum disorder, if they are having difficulties with social skills, for example, we probably want to include social skills training in the therapy adaptation that we're doing, because we want to boost that skill while also helping them deal with their emotional experiences. So I'm thinking, for example, of a little kid who I worked with who he had a lot of social anxiety, and he had pretty mild intellectual disability. And, we were going through like a fear hierarchy, for example, and we're conquering fears with our social anxiety. And one of the goals was to accept a play date or to go play at another child's house. And he did not want to do that. That caused him a lot of anxiety, and it was social, but it was also because he had difficulties with adaptive functioning, and he was worried that he might be embarrassed if he, had to go to the bathroom by himself, because that was something that he needed help with. And so incorporating those skills that might be contributing to anxiety or might be contributing to depression for your client is super important. So it's not just about adapting interventions, but augmenting them and including things that your client might need to help them be successful. Because if I had my client do that fear hierarchy, he may have failed. That may not have been a successful goal for him because of his difficulties with adaptive functioning and those self-care skills. So we want to boost those as well to ensure that he's successful. And so now we're at the end of our content. Are there any questions kind of about what we've talked about so far? Or Ty, do you have anything to add?
I think the only thing I was going to add briefly on the Act is that that is something Shelley and I are both interested in, and we're really interested in figuring out how can we use Act. And one of the things that I've thought through a bit is just asking ourselves what seems useful for people. Sometimes we can get trapped in these therapy modalities and kind of lose sight of our overall goal is to promote well-being. So what's useful for them? And some of my favorite little tips and tricks from ACT don't necessarily work that well with some of the clients I work with. Kind of like Shelley mentioned, is the metacognition, and ACT says, hey, metaphors are how we get them out of that suffering. But she adapted and kind of was flexible on the fly. So empowering yourselves to be flexible and continue asking yourself what seems useful for the client can be very helpful. The second piece I was just going to mention is that I do find myself doing more psychoeducation with caregivers around emotional well-being, because a lot of the times I'll hear, caregivers come in and they'll say something to the effect of, my kiddo has this disability or this adult has this disability, and that's all they'll talk about. And that's how they've been talked to about their, loved one a lot, is that they have a disability and they don't have a full encompassing emotional life. So being able to reorient people back to like, hey, we're all humans. This is a naturally occurring part of the human condition, and we're trying to promote prosperity and well-being can be really powerful, and often just feels like a general conversation that's not a direct intervention, but reminding caregivers and reminding individuals that are like, hey, we're just trying to promote well-being, and your loved one has the full capacity to have their own well-being. Because it feels sometimes when I work with these families, especially as providers, like I don't have that experience, I'm not going to see them. They kind of lose sight of that. So being able to empower clients with like, hey, you have all these strengths. We want to help support them to get the life you want. It may seem really straightforward in like therapy 101, but I do think this population is often kind of ignored in that respect. So reminding everyone to kind of put a spotlight on that can be useful.
Yeah, and one of the things that Ty mentioned earlier about conservatorships or legal guardianships. In some states, there is a push to kind of switch from that into a model called supported decision making, where instead of having somebody become a full legal guardian of someone else, we give them the skills to make their own decisions. And so that's something that we have some information about on our website as well, supported decision making and kind of increasing self-determination for clients. Because if we, like Sunny has mentioned in the chat, if we're increasing their quality of life, if we're giving them more choice and more agency and control, problem behaviors or challenging behaviors might spuriously reduce anyway, because they feel they have a more enriched life, and they have a higher quality of life as well. So that's a really great point.
Yeah, at this point, I think that I was a little fast in my first half, so that was a little bit my part on the timing. But
That's
honestly,
okay.
it's like a pretty communicative group. So if we could just maybe stop sharing the slides and everyone can turn on their videos, and we can kind of transition into that Q&A part where, to be frank, we're all still learning. That's what the evidence is saying. So being able to share resources with each other and build these communities of support can also be super helpful for providers. So I'd love to hear from y'all on what's maybe worked or what hasn't worked, and any other questions that you might have had from any of these 3 webinars. We can, give it quite a bit of time here.
Mm-hmm.
There's a question here for you. So, Bobby Joe asks, how do you handle any of these therapies when the family caregivers don't do the follow through at home? Now, I have some thoughts there too, but what's your approach, Shelley?
Well, I try to figure out why they're not following through at home. Is it difficulties with time? I've worked in some pretty high need areas where parents are perhaps working multiple jobs, and so they just don't have time to practice. And help their child with, my homework assignments or whatever I give them. So I do first want to figure out what's going on and the reason why, because then I can hopefully help get around those barriers or figure out something that can be helpful. If it's in, group homes, like you've mentioned with rotating staff, I might have like build it in with their existing behavior, if they have an existing behavior plan or treatment plan. If it's at a school, having it built into their IEP, because then it's written down and it's something that potentially everybody who works with that client has access to. And it also may just be that they need additional training. And so like with my client, when I did the soles of the feet with him, I also trained his mom in how to do it. So instead of just like giving her the list of instructions, we practiced it together in session so that she felt empowered and, like she could do it on her own without me there. Ty, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's very similar to that. I always try to be curious. Last night I met with a family where I could tell things were happening at home. And so instead of being like, why aren't you doing this? Which I think is the message she often got from other providers. I was curious on like, what supports do you need to make some of these changes feel more possible? And, for that parent, they felt, I think, like empowered to support, because I really believe parents want the best for their kiddos in that case. The other thing I've done with kiddos and even adults with developmental disabilities is spend half the session having working on the skill with the individual or with the client, and then me and the client training whoever the caregiver or provider, like the other support person there is in the home. So it's like me and the client are working together to train parents, so it moves the identified patient off them, so it feels more empowering. And then we get multiple attempts at learning the skill, while also giving it hopefully a better chance of transitioning to home, because then they can hold each other accountable. Really though, it's got to start with, I think, curiosity on why it's not going well at the home situation and figuring out how to triage that first. Before we move on, I'm gonna, just for everyone, before we start jumping off, is I'm gonna post in the chat right now the survey for everyone to fill out, if you wouldn't mind. It helps give us information on how to improve these in the future and maybe future topics. And for those that are wanting continuing education, this is how you get them. So you'll go through the survey, and at the end it'll ask, do you want continuing education? You hit yes, and it redirects you to another survey so your responses stay anonymous. And then you'll enter your info, and over the next 2 weeks, we'll start getting those certificates out to you.
Yeah, and so another thing that I want to add as well with like adherence concerns, sometimes it takes just a little bit of like consultation or psychoeducation with the caregiver or with the staff. You know, I've often had teachers, for example, tell me that they don't have time to implement like a behavioral intervention with a kid because they spend so much time like correcting their behavior or, you know, disciplining. And I'll say, if you can dedicate 15 minutes to this, my hope is that these other issues that you're having will reduce. And so kind of getting like doing a little bit of motivational stuff with them about like, if you can dedicate some time doing this, you might save much more time later on other activities because the client is more, you know, independent, or they're doing things on their own now, and you can spend less time in the long run. And so sometimes that's been helpful as well. If the reason that I'm given is, oh, I don't have time, or this is just like an extra thing that I have to do, which is a very valid concern for a lot of staff and a lot of teachers. And so I like to do a lot of that front end work for them, but also encourage them that if they dedicate a little bit of time right now, it will potentially save them time in the future because it will reduce, you know, whatever problem they're seeing or having to deal with.
There's another comment here that I wanted to just briefly touch on. There's research on ACT with caregivers, which may help with some of the adherence concerns. And yeah, there is actually quite a robust literature base on ACT for caregivers of various issues, actually. So active caregivers of individuals with like developmental disabilities, of individuals with dementia. So there's some pretty robust support that says, hey, when you're managing stress, this can be helpful. One of the things that we've looked at in some of the research I've collaborated on is what seems to be helpful within the ACT model. And what we're starting to see more and more is the values component, really helping parents and the caregivers get more connected to the qualities they want to show up in their parenting and in, you know, their homes. And those values tend to start driving the behavior. In some of my conversations with caregivers and individuals with developmental disabilities, trying to figure out what matters to them is super motivating and gives them a compass to start guiding a lot of the change. And it feels less, you know, laborious, which can be super helpful. So yeah, thanks for that comment. We got another one here. You mentioned a treatment protocol called ARC. What does it stand for? I always.
Is it attachment, regulation, and competency?
Yes, it is that. That is exactly it. So I actually worked with her, the creator. I can't remember her name either because I'm not good with names, but she was a great supervisor. She supervised us for about a year in our implementation here at our clinic. And it was really helpful because she really focused on routines and just doing the behavior training consistently, but around emotional support. So for clients with trauma, clients with developmental disabilities, and clients with both, it seems to be pretty useful. The awkward silence. Do we have any more questions from the rest of the group that might be useful for everyone else to kind of process through, or any thoughts, or maybe even some like wins that y'all have had clinically that you would like to share?
This question is a Oh, okay. So struggling with behavior, getting more involved with skill development at home. I think that working with teenagers is a special challenge because they are like blossoming in their independence. And so oftentimes with younger kids, things are very parent monitored or caregiver monitored. And then you start to switch to more maybe like self-monitoring things. And so I think my overall suggestion is giving him control and agency over what he is doing, if with the skills that he's learning. But then if you are able to check behind him, and see that he is completing things. Yeah, I'm not sure. Ty, do you have any other?
I work mostly with teenagers, and I think what Shelley just said kind of resonates strongly. It really is so dependent on the specific teen, but some of the guiding rules, I think, is that the more you can practice the specific skills yourself and
Mhm.
that you're doing the work, can be really compelling for kiddos. So they go, oh, they're not just preaching it, they're practicing it, and I can experience it rather than having to try to explain it to them, can be really useful for teens that are going like, well, why am I going to do it? They're not doing it. And that's one side door, but it's so dependent upon, unique situations that I feel like there's not great general advice there.
Yeah. I would say as much as he can be kind of in control of it, he's more likely to participate. So if it's something that can be collaborative with him, and that you can kind of check behind him, I don't know. Yeah, it is tricky with teenagers.
I will say, usually with teens, though, the one thing I do ask them that often a lot of adults won't is like, what actually matters to you and what do you
Yeah.
want it to look like? And when you're able to start there and actually hear what their vision is, they'll often realize that some of the approaches they're using aren't super useful for helping them get there. And then
Mhm.
they're usually much more open to use their own cares as that compass to start guiding things. But just being patient and realize developmentally, it's pretty appropriate for a teen to mess up a lot and keep learning from it. So,
Yeah. And I even might say directly, like, your goals are this, but your mom's goals are these. Is there a way that we can reconcile or work on both? Um, if those goals are like largely misaligned.
and Jessica provided some useful resources here. One of our partners, actually, with the MHDD Center is NAD, and they have a few different resources that are available. One's the family support group that's very active, and the other is a clinical certification for the duly diagnosed population through nadd.org. National Council has IDD interest group. Both of these organizations can provide some additional resources and training on clinical interventions. Yeah, so thank you for providing that, Jessica. They are, very useful too.
Collaborative problem solving, yes, that is a great technique that you can use for like when you're working with multiple people or if you're working with a family. Excellent.
So where we're here at 105, we've had about 10 minutes of conversation. Are there any other questions we can help address? Otherwise, we'll kind of keep us moving along so we can maybe earn back some of our day for maybe a nice walk outside. We're having a step challenge at our work. I got to get my steps in, guys.
Oh my goodness. Okay. Well, we really appreciate everybody that has joined. Fall within moderate IDD. So yeah, I think that for people who have maybe more moderate presentations of intellectual or developmental disabilities, you do kind of want to pivot to be more concrete, more behavioral, and less cognitive, lots of talking. Because if it is super abstract or if it is super kind of complicated for somebody to understand, if having it more skills focused or more behavioral focused is is what is going to be probably most beneficial for them. Treatment modalities that you would like to see research done. I think that well, Ty and I may be biased because we both work a lot in ACT. So we probably want to see more ACT interventions because they are really values and strengths focused. And, you know, kind of like living the life that you want and setting the goals that you want. And so those are the approaches that I personally enjoy as a clinician because they are person focused and strengths and values focused. So that would be my hope is more research for an ACT specifically. Anything you want to add, Ty?
Just repeat what Shelley says, because some of the research that I have ongoing right now is actually exploring ACT and psychological flexibility in individuals with autism. So that's the hope, is to start building some of that. Being a marriage and family therapist, some systems level work, things like Center for Start Services, finding ways to do that in other states that are useful for the state, or maybe work within that state system. You know, that Center for Start Services does that well, and finding other models that might do that and include families as a whole more, some of that systems-based work, I think could be pretty cool. There are also a few other comments here too that I thought were useful. Mm-hmm. So what is the best approach when working with clients who might be nonverbal? And then another question, speak to using EMDR. So I'll go to both of those just briefly, and then Shelley, you can speak for it. So I've actually worked with kiddos with autism that are nonverbal, but they still communicate a lot through behaviors and through different ways. So using some of those speech language pathology tool sets, pictures is how we got through a lot of our sessions, and including, you know, the parent-child relationship. So being a systems-based therapist was really useful. I actually don't have any training with EMDR, and I'm not familiar with the literature on that, so I can't speak to it, unfortunately. Shelley, do you have any thoughts on those two?
So I am not trained in EMDR. I know that, you know, it could potentially be very helpful for somebody who has a hard time verbalizing their trauma, because it is, you know, with the eye movements and being able to kind of desensitize themselves to something traumatic that happened. I think my gut feeling is that it could be really helpful for somebody who might have communication difficulties. But again, I'm also not trained in it, so I apologize as well. But I do think that is an interesting question. For working with nonverbal clients or clients who are pre-verbal or not yet talking, I think that, like what Ty has said, using whatever way they are communicating to help with your adaptations. So if they are able to communicate more visually, if they have an augmented communication device, if they sign, what are they doing to communicate their needs to you? And can you incorporate your therapeutic interventions in that way?
Another question here, wondering perspectives on the DMID2 usage or promotion of its use for clinicians in this field for accuracy in mental health diagnoses. So I'll just give you kind of my approach. That was actually one of the first books that I read in this content area. You know, I'm not specially trained in working with individuals with IDD, whereas Shelley has more of that background and training. And I jumped into this field because there's a need. And then we started figuring out, how do we train more providers like myself who might be interested in getting in? So I think it can be a useful book to try to help you understand maybe some of the basics. But from my understanding, there still isn't like robust data behind the diagnoses. And to be kind of honest, the ACT approach uses more of a process-based approach that's moving or trying to move away more from diagnoses and more towards what processes seem to help people, you know, prosper. And so I think it can be useful, especially when you're consulting with the teams and you need to have an idea. But as far as like an everyday usage, I'm more interested in how do we get some of that prospering going on. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that, Shelley?
I think that, I kind of agree with you. I think figuring out like the emotional experience of the client and how it relates or doesn't relate to their disability is really helpful. I think that, yeah, I kind of agree with Ty that, focusing on what are the things that are going on in this client's life that is either maintaining their anxiety or maintaining their depression, and can we work to fix those things. Yeah, sorry, it was kind of a rambly, vague. What organization do you recommend for the best ACT training? So I really, I'll type her name in the chat. If you work with young adults or adolescents or kids, Louise Hayes is really good. Steve Hayes, no relation, is also good. He works more with adults. Most of his trainings are adult focused. And then I talked about the Association for Contextual Behavior Science also sponsors some trainings, and they have so many resources and materials on their website. If you join ACBS, they have a lot of resources, worksheets, literature, measures to use. And yeah, Stephen Hayes, Louise Hayes. Louise Hayes is more child focused. So yeah, those are really great resources, particularly for ACT.
Just a quick follow-up. If you're looking for more CEs, Praxis Continuing Education actually has 3 ACT courses going on right now. So 2 from Stephen Hayes, who is one of the main creators of ACT, and then 1 on focused acceptance and commitment therapy with Kirk Stroessel, who's another creator of ACT. I've actually done all 3 of them. I think they're very useful. So if you're more interested in that, that's the way you can get connected. And Louise Hayes' stuff with teens is stellar. I really like it. So it looks like, man, we've actually done really well at communicating with everyone throughout. I'm just proud of us right now. So I think we can probably transition to, wrapping things up. Do you have any last words of advice, Shelley, or anything you want to end on?
Be strengths focused. I feel like that's my biggest thing, and incorporating your clients' values and their perspective, because we may say something is a problem and they may not. And so we want to be helpful for them. And that's my tiny soapbox.
I appreciate it. And I'm happy to end on that soapbox. So thank you all for joining us. And I hope that you can follow us along at the MHDDcenter.org. Find us on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter. I've got this sales pitch down. If you need to contact us at all, please email me at ty.aller@usu.edu if you have any about the CEs. Otherwise, we'll look forward to connecting with y'all on the interwebs, and hopefully maybe one day meet some people in person again, right? Feels like we're getting close, I hope. Anyway, thanks again for everyone for joining, and hope y'all have a good day.